Hello, Steve.
Evening, Chief. I'll share my screen. There wasn't anything in the agenda, but we'll wait for a few minutes to see if who else shows up before we see if there's any topics to discuss.
Steve, if there is no other topics, maybe we can start from the init data issue, what in
Yeah,
place.
sure. I'll put it. Hey, James. Hey, Magnus.
Hello.
A little bit low on attendance,
Hey.
so we'll give it another minute and see if anyone else is able to join us. Guess while we're waiting, so we've got one topic so far to have a bit of a chat on the init data approach for PeerPods. Is there anything else anyone wants to put on the agenda? Assuming we have enough and the right set of people to talk about it.
Maybe the intermediate release.
Yep. David Nibson.
Hey Steve, hello everyone.
Hey, cool. Should we start with the release question, because it'll probably be a little bit quicker to run through. So yeah, I don't know if people saw last week, but based on our hi Vanna, thanks for joining. Based on the discussion we had, I created this issue, so 1677, with a few sort of things on the task list to point out. So do people think that's a reasonable approach, and did I accurately represent where we want to pin the KBS, make sure that we've got a link to the documentation, and then it's primarily just testing stuff out? Does that make sense to everyone else? And okay, does it not make sense to anyone? Maybe it's a better one. Okay, so Magnus, I think you had a version of the KBS. So yeah, I'm not sure if you can share it or just make the PR into versions.yaml to kick that first one off.
Yeah, can do this.
Cool. And then yeah, I think we can just sort of go through the steps. So anything else we want to chat about release, this release wise? Cool. Okay, it's nice and quick.
There's
yeah,
one issue
sorry.
I noticed
Mhm.
because I saw the pull request was merged with this kind of
documentation
convenience script. Yeah, there's
Yep.
a couple of things that are interesting. So first of all, it seems Scopio is broken with the latest Docker version. So they're on it, I think, and probably a fix is pending. But it's just interesting that if people update Docker, Scopio will not work. But this applies to all the image encryption steps that we have. It's just something maybe worth mentioning here. So if you run into this when you try this, it's not you, it's Scopio. And then there is another question. This image, the key provider image, is only built at release time of, I suppose, guest components or Coco. So here it's a bit tricky.
Yeah, I think it's the it's the KBS component that builds it. But yeah, I do remember doing it sort of early in release process.
Yeah, so I mean that's like if you reference to this one in the docs, we would also need to either build an image based on this on guest components, which means guest components then is also kind of versioned, which is maybe not what we want, or we need to provide instructions on how to build that image. Which is not hard, but yeah, it takes a while.
Yeah, I guess we can have a chat and see if there is any appetite to make a new 0.8.1 release of guest components as the first step, and otherwise, yeah, I guess if we want to keep it completely isolated to Cloud API adapter, we'd have to take on that instructions until the 0.9 release.
Yeah, I mean, we can also put it maybe in the scope of the Cloud API adapter repo, you know.
Yeah.
It's, I think it's more or less, yeah, again, a matter of convenience, I think.
I think there's a separate discussion I think happening. There's a bug, shall we say, in is it the key broker service and the guest components, I think, which there are conversations about rolling a 0.8.1 of guest, well, I don't know about all the guest components, but there is talk about rolling a 0.8.1 for something else that needs to go in. So it might be a kind of an open door to put them both in and put them both into 0.8.1. Tobin probably has more knowledge of where that's up to, I think, in terms of rolling a 0.8.1.
Actually, yes, that's a good point. I think that could be actually coincidentally happen at the same time. Maybe if EY is also interested, that we plan to have some 0.8.1 release, maybe we can synchronize this, and then this would all be no issue. Ideally, then we would even use, you know, like the KBS version and the guest components version that is at least close to an official release.
Yeah.
Good point.
Because I'm not sure we've bumped the guest components particularly recently. Okay, 3 weeks, so it's not super old, but yeah, if it if there is a new release, then obviously it would be worth waiting a small delay to pick up a released version, and try and sync up with them, definitely. Do you know if that's going to be talked about tomorrow, James, or is it a sensitive security topic, so probably not raised?
I think it is a bit sensitive, so it's probably worth just reaching out to Tobin directly. I'm not sure it'll be discussed on a recorded call, shall we say?
Yeah. I mean, this is a recorded call, but we won't discuss in the details of what the bug is, just that there is one. Yeah.
Yes, it's being fixed. We don't want to start going into it here. It's being addressed.
Yeah. So, Magnus, are you okay to chat to Tobin and sync up on that?
Yes, I can do this. I'll be on vacation 1 week, the coming week. So if that somehow falls into this week, then maybe better if someone else does this. I mean, so I think there's more talk in other circles about this issue, and also for a while. So I think it's probably just a matter of someone raising it to Tobin and saying, like, we also plan to do a Cloud API adapter release, but I can just drop him a line on Slack.
Yeah, that would be great. And yeah, in terms of actually doing the release and stuff, then that's fine. I'm sure we can cover it. But yeah, just trying to understand if we've got a commit, or that might turn into the tag, at least for testing, would be helpful. Cool. So, yep, the other agenda item is the attestation agent design for init data that Magnus mentioned last week, and I know there's been a few comments from Magnus through this, and I think Chifeng's also been looking at it. I must admit, I'm definitely not up to date and fully informed with it, but it might be worth seeing if there's anything we can share about this, any potential issues we see, or questions that we need to raise to Ding and others. So I don't know if you want to kick off, Chifeng or Magnus.
And Chifeng had an interesting point, I think, but that's more generic. I think that it applies to everything. So it's more or less a question like, how is init data? How can we actually trust that we're talking to the right KBS? And this is like a very complex question that I think was addressed several times, but it's tricky. But I don't think it has to do with this approach particularly. So the approach here is more or less technical. I think the challenges that we have is like, how do we actually facilitate this whole mechanism? I think, and I think Tobin made kind of 3 categories, and I don't know, in an earlier comment. Yeah, exactly. So this, to summarize this, so there's a way to inject the hash into the report initially. However, there's an asterisk, not right now everywhere. So this is a feature of SNP TDX. However, in SNP, it depends on the feature that is currently not used in Kata. So on the kernel, on kernel patches. Yeah. So at the moment, this doesn't work, which gives us also a bit of room to look for solutions. So this might very well not be in the 09 timeframe. and I'm in a conversation with Tobin, I also like, I don't think there's a pressure to do this. It's better maybe to do this right instead of ending up with something that is not really great for all use cases. So that's like, yeah, the S&P lagging behind is a bit yeah, works for us here because we can experiment more. Then there's SV90X. This is interesting because init data, there, at least Tobin says there's no way to do this or to seed something in there. Potentially it would have to be baked into the image or something like this. So there's no concept really for init data on this platform. So, or it's not considered here as something that we have to include. And then the third point is, if you are not able to feed the value into the report, but are able to perform runtime measurements, which is more or less an extension of this, how do you, how will this look like? And there it's a bit of a question, like who is starting at the station agent, and we like, yeah, which APIs are available, because at the moment there's kind of a circular dependency there that at the station agent is only called by Kata or launched by Kata. And at this point, the policy should already be applied, and this doesn't work. So if you have to verify that the policy is actually genuine, you cannot do it in this fashion. So
yeah, that was the point that Qifeng made on the original. I think it was in the community repo issue, is if you do that in the agent, how do you get it in before that? So
exactly, but this is more like how you orchestrate things. There's a few logical things that are tricky, because I mean, what's happening initially is there's a verification step that makes sure that the host data matches, the host data and the report matches the injected configuration. And this is like, yeah, this is tricky to understand, because essentially it's all unverified components that are verifying unverified data. This is a bit weird, because actually it doesn't mean a lot from the point of confidentiality. And it's only later that in remote attestation, you could actually say, okay, all this made some sense initially, but it's very hairy. Like there's a lot of implications for it. But essentially, this is a requirement of S&P and TDX, that they kind of do this data binding check, even though it looks weird. But other platforms don't have to do this, because they can perform runtime measurements. I think TDX can also perform runtime measurements, but it's not so trivial. So yeah, so my idea would be more or less, I would suggest to just get some POC running for this, like similar to the secure key release topic, where we see, okay, this is logically what we have to have in place to get this workflow going. And this will probably rely on forks of maybe KVS or guest components. And then we see, like, how would this look in practice? And then we can kind of also use this as a reference to influence the target design.
That makes sense. Chifeng
Because
sorry,
it's
go.
very abstract. I think very hard for people to get in and understand what's actually required here.
Yeah, I think like you say, we need to be careful of blocking because 0.9 is already under a bunch of pressure. We don't want to block it behind it. But in the same way, there's some challenges that some of the integration of building, say, the attestation agent and hooking it in is slightly changed behavior, it looks like, potentially. Or I've seen comments saying, oh, well, init data is going to change the way configuration is done, so we can get rid of agent config and bits like that. And the attestation agent no longer getting KBC params, etc., via the kata agent and image RS. So I don't know if they have been already implemented that way or if that's still just in PRs and stuff. But yeah, we might have a bit of a challenge to stick things together because I think some people are already thinking in the init data way, so we might have to backtrack a little bit to get 0.9 without this. But
that's what I would recommend, actually. So because this change is very fuzzy and the implications are unclear, and I don't see like it being necessary right now. I think the only reason you might want to do this is because with the merge to main, the question, do you actually want to port the AAKBC param stuff over? Yeah. So this is something that will end up done in main and maybe potentially then be revised very quickly.
Yeah.
This is an argument, I think, that's probably hard. Or a good argument.
Yeah, we'll probably have to have that discussion if it's not already on Linda's PR, I guess, which I probably can't find right now. But this one, which I think there's been some discussions. Yeah, this is the one that, yeah, Magnus, we were talking about, basically saying, yeah, so this is where I read Ding says AAKBCs is no longer used in image RS anymore. So that's what made me question if it's some of it's already been implemented. But yeah, we can certainly try and square that away. Well, we'll have to square it away as part of this BR, or the tests won't pass. So
yeah, but I think in terms of release management, it's good to not have like those two big changes.
Yeah. Yes.
I would rather go for deprecating a param at one point. Yeah.
And I think that, well, we'll see what happens. But Demi-High has been raising the idea of deprecating agent config for policy stuff in vanilla kata in general. So there might be some more discussions around that as well. Chifeng, was there anything you wanted to bring up and discuss on this topic? Because I think you've certainly looked into it more than I have.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if that related with the kata issue you just have on Steve. Is that a must-have to merge this one and to implement this proposal to get that kata CCV0 merged to main? Is that bounded?
So yeah, so what I was saying is that there's been some change which I don't necessarily fully understand already has gone into image RS in the way that the KBC params are passed. I thought that it was made sort of to sync up with some of the init data ideas. And yeah, Tobin says, oh, agent config is going to be superseded by init data policy. So I thought, oh, this is going to effectively, init data might end up blocking this PR, which is part of merge domain. But if we are taking a more slow and measured approach with init data, which I think makes total sense, then it just means we might have to work out, is there a different way that we need to organize this if we don't pass a KBC params via the agent config, which is read via the kernel params, what is our approach to configure that to the attestation agent? And that's a bit I'm not particularly clear. I don't really understand, but I've not dug into it too much, so it might be very clear to other people.
But I mean, we could still
Yeah.
deprecate the param here, right? This is not a problem. This is because if you have config files instead, would this be?
So, sorry, I'm might be slow. So at the moment, the way the parameter is either set is set through either in PeerPods we set it directly in agent config.toml, and for local hypervisor it's set via the kernel params. It's passed through as agent.aakbc params. So we suggesting a different approach we could do, which wouldn't need this, Magnus, or?
I mean, there's an approach. I think that it was Tobin was mentioning. So there's config files for all of those. Now, I hope. Like, I mean, I think the issue is still open, but essentially, instead of, like putting the entry in kata agent, like templating the kata agent file, you populate an attestation agent file.
Oh yeah, so for
like,
for PeerPods, I think that's fine, and we can either push it in either the process user data or some other mechanism. I was more thinking about local hypervisor. How do we pass that through? How do we set up those config if we don't have something like init data? Yeah, I'm not so worried about PeerPods. Sorry, I wasn't being clear on this.
Yeah, probably in a similar way. You probably instead of like the kernel command line would be read in those components, possibly. That's how I understood.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we could just reuse the same logic that we used to strip out the kernel params and just put that logic in the attestation agent. Yeah, that could work. We could just change the start prefix because it's like agent dot, I think. So we could just make attestation or AA or whatever we want to do. Yeah, that makes sense. Or guest components. I don't know if that helped answer the question, Chief.
Yeah, so I think I need to catch up the change of this kata PR. So yeah, I think I missed something. So I think I don't have more comments again.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm quite behind on this as well. I did look at it originally, but yeah, it's just some of the things have changed since CCG0, particularly around config. So we're not adding all the same options. We've also got some challenges around offline file system and stuff like that, which might impact us in PeerPods because that's sort of the way that some of our stuff like the registry authentication, dynamic registry authentication is baked in by us sticking it in the right place. But I know Tobin's keen to remove offline file system KBCs for all of the testing in Kata. So I don't know if that's realistic to happen or if that's another thing that would just delay 0.9, but might might result in us doing stuff which isn't fully tested in Kata, which in the short term it's probably okay, but obviously long term we want to be receiving these things from a KBC or somewhere measured a bit better anyway.
Yeah, but in the short term, I would imagine that again, like just instead of writing it to kata agent config file, you write it to the attestation agent config file. Pretty much the same information.
Yeah, so part of the challenge with the offline file system stuff, maybe not so much the resources, and we don't have to go into this too much, is some of the stuff we are passing through is what we're currently baking in is decryption keys. And you obviously don't want to put your, well, I don't think you want to put your decryption keys in the kernel params, because then they can be, everyone can see them. So that's the kind of challenge we have with some of this testing. But
yeah, but I mean, it's not the payload that we're interested in. I mean, the problem is this AAKBC params carries a URL, and it also carries, like, it's two things. Yeah. So it's a type, it's a KBC type.
Yeah.
And this will still be there. Yeah. So I mean, you have to basically tell some component what KBC are we using. And now it's probably offline FS or something, and then the other parameter is empty, I suppose, because there's no URI or anything. Right. This, you still have to put this value in somewhere, and this would be then the attestation agent config, I suppose.
Yeah, that bit's fine. It's more how in this code we don't have a way of injecting and sourcing the file. So again, for PeerPods, we've got our sort of workarounds we're doing with process user data, so not so much of a challenge. But in local hypervisor, we don't have the same mechanisms at the moment for hacking about with the image, because it's not supplied by us. It is, but it's supplied in kata deploy in a non-fudgeable place. Now we're deploying to AKS, whereas previously we deployed it locally, so we would just build it, modify it ourselves, and inject it. But anyway, that's a bit off topic. That's more local hypervisor testing stuff, which we will need to work out, but it's not the responsibility of everyone in this community call. So. But any other thoughts or questions around this init data topic? Okay, and are there any other things we want to bring up and discuss on today's call?
Maybe a question. So any idea if any idea how we can use the measurements of the PodVM components and kind of get it verified as part of the attestation? So any thoughts? I mean, we don't need to answer, but if someone has any idea and already looking into that, would love to hear their thoughts. Basically, what I'm looking at is the PodVM components. How do we measure them, and how do we verify that those are indeed the components as part of the attestation workflow?
So Suraj, at the moment, at least for the Azure part, is adding the PCR to the evidence. So if you use, I think it works on both images, but essentially there's measurements on on the TPMs that happen to a certain level. I think on the Packer images probably to the kernel and init RD, and the MCOSI image covers the whole image, like as a DM Verity with a DM Verity configuration. And so this means you have the PCRs as part of the evidence, and you can write reference values that match those. So if this answers your question. I mean, it's not completely there because I think there needs to be some, it needs to be added to the claims or something like this. And in general, KBS development is always a bit slow, but I mean, for good reasons. But in theory, this should work like this.
Yeah, I think the MCOSI image just uses the PCRs. But yeah, the other part is what I was mostly interested in, and I think you answered it. Like it's not part of the claims, and then eventual verification at the KBS. So those will be or at least the missing components, like having this as part of the claims and then verifying it in the KBS.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's a very minor change eventually, because I think the PRs that some of them are merged yet. I think only one in KBS is left open that integrates the PCRs as evidence on the verifier side and makes sure everything, like the PCRs, are also proper and not arbitrary. And then you would probably just have some 2 lines or something to add them to the claims. So this is a minor change actually. That's missing.
Yeah. Thanks, Magnus. That answers my question. Thank you.
Thanks. Anything else you want to chat about? Okay. I've got a little bit of admin. I might be missing next week's call. I'm not 100% sure if I'll be able to make it or not. And then the week after, I will be out. James will be out, and I know that Dolly and Chifeng will be out for a while for New Year celebrations.
Yeah, I will be out for 2 weeks next week and the next week. Yeah, week after next week. Yeah.
So yeah, we can still open up the call and stuff, and if we have less agenda and less numbers, we can always end it earlier. But yeah, we might be a little bit low for the next couple of weeks. But otherwise, I guess we can end it there. And yeah, thanks for the chat. Thanks Magnus for sharing a lot of stuff today. It's been helpful.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Speak soon.
Bye.
See you. Ciao.